Morning. Morning, morning. We started our class last Sunday talking about some lessons from the life of Samuel, and we want to continue that. This is the last class that I'll be teaching for a while. So you can take that any way you want it, I guess. Anyway, when we were talking about Samuel last week, we pointed out that Samuel, from a very young age, was given to God. The name itself, Samuel, means ask of God. His mother had asked for Samuel. And Samuel goes at a very young age, somewhere between 3 and 5, to live with Eli. And he basically becomes a servant for the children of Israel his entire life. And he is a selfless servant. One of the things that we observe that tends to happen to us as human beings, if either by ability or by happenstance or by birth, we end up doing quite well, what tends to happen to our ego? Yeah, it tends to go up, right? Because what's the difference between being poor and being rich in terms of the mentality that we have? Why would my confidence be different if I have a lot of money? I have a safety net, or I think I do, right? When Luann's saying that it's false. You know, would you rather be rich or poor? In the middle? Colleen says in the middle. No, we don't want to be in the middle. We want to be rich, and we want to be as rich as we can possibly be. And rich people, by the way, are never satisfied with however much wealth they have. If I was as rich as Jeff Bezos, right? If I had that kind of money, I could basically buy anything I want. What do people do when they have that kind of money? How do they spend their time? They sometimes, we're not going to necessarily say stupid things. She's got to stick with that. Ursay is one of the more wealthy people in our community, right? What's one of the things that he does with his money that's a little, some of us might think it's a little unusual. Some of us might think, go, we like what you're doing. He collects what? He collects musical instruments. What kind of musical instruments does he collect?
Oh, like Beatles, guitars.
So a guitar like George Harrison played, but what else does he collect? Not just guitars. He's tried to collect football players. That's a little more iffy proposition. He collects documents. He put on a presentation a couple of years ago at Lucas Oil with all of the stuff that he'd collected. And one of the things he collected was the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book was one of the documents that he had. He had documents from the Founding Fathers. Now, some of us like that particular hobby, but cannot indulge in it to the same extent that Mr. Ursay can, right? But once I collect that kind of stuff, what do I want to move on to if I have real money? What am I going to collect next?
Real estate?
No! Not real estate. I've already got real estate. What? Friends. What kind of friends?
Out of the woodwork.
I want famous friends, don't I? When I was a kid, one of the richest men in the world was a man named Aristotle Onassis. And Onassis collected people. And some of the people that he collected were Winston Churchill, who was often on Aristotle's yacht, Maria Callas, who was one of the most famous opera singers in the world, and of course, most famously, he collected Jackie Kennedy. You have money, and your mind sometimes goes in strange directions. And we tend to all be affected to some extent by money. And yet, what do we know about money as Christians? The love, not money, but the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. The challenge for us as human beings is that when we have money, it's pretty hard not to love the money, right? But it's not impossible. It's not impossible to be a person of integrity. And one of the things that Samuel shows us in his life is he lives his life as a person of integrity because he doesn't veer to the left or to the right. Most of us, my daughter and I were talking about this the other day. There's one famous person I always wanted to meet, never got to meet. I was just a big admirer of his. I enjoyed his work, and that was James Garner. And I came very close to meeting James Garner 2 or 3 times. And it just never worked out, right? But most of us, we have somebody that we would really like to meet. If I ask most of you, is there somebody that you really admire? Most of us would have somebody. And it might be somebody profound, it might be somebody foolish, in my opinion. Doesn't mean that would be foolish, but foolish simply means somebody that I wouldn't care about, right? Somebody that you might think, why in the world would you want to meet James Garner, right? But we tend to, as human beings, all have things that influence us, no matter how much we think we're not influenceable, for lack of a better way of saying it. The thing that we see in the life of Samuel is he's a person who cannot be bought. He can't be rented. He's not interested in what somebody can do for him. He's interested in one thing and one thing only, and that's serving God with all of his heart, mind, and soul. And so we find Samuel, and we talked last Sunday about the fact that Samuel was asked to appoint a king, and he takes that as a personal rejection. But God tells Samuel, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. Samuel is sitting there feeling like, I've done everything right. Right? Sometimes that happens to us. We're in situations where we feel like, I've done everything that I possibly can right. Clearly, people should know that I'm the right person for job X or Y. And what often happens? You're not selected. Some other deadbeat selected, who clearly is not the right guy for the job. This is an actual situation that happened to me about 20 years ago. I had an opportunity to interview for the job that I currently hold. The only problem with me interviewing for that particular job was I had absolutely no experience. But everyone that interviewed me knew that I was very, very good at everything I'd ever done. And they came to me and said, we want you to interview for this job. You're the guy. And I interviewed with like 7 or 8 different people. They all knew me. They all knew that I was very, very good at what I had done throughout my career, which at that point was probably 10 years with my company. So they have a long track record of seeing success, success, success. Clearly, in my mind, I'm absolutely the right guy for the job. The guy that asked me to interview calls me up one day and says, we've made the final decision, we're going with Joe Blow. Like, what? Now, I had a lot of things running through my mind that I wanted to say, and if I was a younger man, I would have said them all. But look, with age comes some wisdom, right? With age comes some wisdom. So first of all, I made clear that I thought they'd made the absolute wrong decision. And I explained why. And I said, I know all the players. I understand that I don't have experience in real estate per se, but I know how to get things done. In very large companies, it's very, very hard to get things done. Large bureaucracies, they tend to be siloed. I knew all the players, and I knew all the players on a first-name basis. And so I began to go through all the reasons why. And the person on the phone then was like, well, he could tell I wasn't happy with the decision they'd made, even though I was being very professional. And I wasn't saying some of the things that were in my mind. Things like seduced and abandoned came to mind. I did not share that. Right? I didn't share that. And so the person on the phone who had encouraged me to apply for this job was like, well, I hope this wouldn't impact our friendship, or that you wouldn't, basically that I wouldn't be too upset by this. And I said, don't misunderstand me. I'm a very competitive person. I hate to lose. My father used to say, son, you show me a good loser and I'll show you a loser. I hate to lose. And I said, I feel like I've lost, and I feel like, I feel like it's not the right decision. But I said to him, it's your job to make the best decision you can. And if you think this is the best decision, I'll support you completely. I'll do everything I can to help this guy. 2 weeks go by, and he said, call me in 2 weeks and we'll see if we can find, he knew I was ready to do something else. Call me in 2 weeks, we'll see if we can find something else. So 2 weeks later I called him and he goes, you're not going to believe what happened. Meanwhile, I had written everyone that had interviewed me, thanking them for taking the time to interview me. I didn't really feel like doing much of this, right? Because I did sort of feel like I had been led down the primrose path, and then carpet got pulled out from under me. Anyway, I did all the right things. So 2 weeks later, I'm with the decider of this particular job, and he goes, well, you won't believe what happened. We offered the guy the money, and he came back and said he had to have $30,000 more. So we're not hiring him, and you've got the job. And he said, I've never seen anybody handle not getting a job any better than the way you handled not getting the job. Well, I've been doing the job for 20 years and doing quite well. What happens to us as human beings sometimes is people make decisions that are arbitrary and that really aren't the best decision. I never had any doubt, just because of the confidence that I had in myself, that everything I was telling him was true, that I was head and shoulders better than the guy they ended up offering the gig to. But I could tell other stories where it didn't end up that way, right? People made a different decision, maybe because somebody was related to somebody, maybe because somebody was thought of in a way that they should not be thought of. It's hard, isn't it, to maintain our integrity when bad things happen. And believe me, I was very frustrated for a couple of weeks. I'd spent 6 months interviewing, on top of everything else. So these sorts of things happen to us in life from time to time. Samuel is the kind of man that he never veers to the left, he never veers to the right, no matter what people are doing. And people often tell you, what a great guy you are, and then they ignore you. You're Mr. Wonderful, but no, we're not going to use you. Well, there are differences in the message. Samuel is never moved by that. He cares about serving God and being obedient to God. He cares about serving the people and doing what's in the best interest of the people at all times. That's what you want from leaders, isn't it? And yet it's incredibly, incredibly rare, because it's so easy for us to be co-opted. And it's easy for me to look at others and say, I can't believe they did X, Y, or Z. But if I was in the same situation, would I do the same thing? How great would the temptation be to do the same thing? Well, Israel decides they want to have a king, and this means a rejection of Samuel. And so Samuel then calls the people before him, and he gives them a speech, and it's a speech about his personal integrity. And in that speech, Samuel points out, this is after he's already anointed Saul, that he's never coveted anything that anybody possessed. He's never taken a bribe. He's never one time been tempted to do the wrong thing. What do we know about the love of money? It's the root of all kinds of evil, right? It's hard to have money and not love it. I'm just going to tell you, practically speaking, it's hard to have money and not love it. We can say we're not doing it, but Samuel, when he's talking to the people, and he's telling them about the kind of person that he's been, he's stressing to them. And here's what he says, 1 Samuel 12. He said, "Behold, here I am, witness against me before the Lord." He's saying, I'm a person, he's about to say, I'm a person of integrity, and if you don't believe it, this is your chance. He says, before his anointed, so he says, before the people and before King Saul, here's what I want to ask you. Whose ox have I taken? Whose ass have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I depressed? Or of whose hand have I received any bribe to blind my eyes? Point it out and I'll restore it immediately. And the people replied, You've not defrauded us nor oppressed us, neither hast thou taken anything of any man's hand. And he said to them, The Lord is a witness against you, and has anointed this day, that you have not found anything in my hand. I haven't taken anything that I shouldn't take. I haven't been influenced in any way that I should not be influenced. I'm sort of struck as I was thinking about this, you start thinking about American history. And of course, in our country, the top job is president. And we know that politically, presidents have their hands out pretty much all the time. And it doesn't matter which party they're a member of. And I find myself wondering, when did that get to be such a thing? Who's the last president who was truly a person of integrity? I don't mean a perfect president. I don't mean a president who didn't make mistakes, but a person whose integrity that I could compare to Samuel, who's not going to take the money, right? And I started thinking about Harry Truman. Now, I wasn't born when Harry Truman was president of the United States, but Truman is a person of absolute integrity. How do we know that? He leaves office as president. There's no presidential pension. You wonder, why does Truman go back to Independence to live in the house that he lived in before he was president? Because he can't afford to go live anywhere else. He's got no money. He has a very small Army pension. That's it. And so what has Truman offered? He's offered $100,000 to be on the board of a real estate company in Florida, to be a director. Truman's like, not doing it. He's offered money for public speaking. If you want to see the kind of graft that's involved with ex-presidents, look at the kind of money that they receive for giving speeches. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single speech. Truman is like, if people wouldn't pay plain old Harry Truman that kind of money before I was president, I'm not going to trade on having been president to take the money. He doesn't take any of the money. Right? Since Gerald Ford was president, every single ex-president's got their hands out to be on boards, to take money, to give speeches. You can pay me off before I'm president, or you can pay me off after I'm president. I'm still being paid off. Truman is like, the office is bigger than this. I'm not going to do that. And he's a stunning person when you put him in historical context, because it's not like he's living in the 1800s when there's no money. He's living in 1952 where there's a line of people wanting to make him rich. And he does not take the money. This is the kind of person that Samuel is. And so Samuel demonstrates to us that whether I'm rich or whether I'm poor, I can serve God. Whether I have political influence or whether I have no political influence, I can serve God. Whatever my circumstance is, whatever situation I'm in, whatever God is calling me to do, I can serve God if I'm true to my integrity. But understand something, there's never been another Harry Truman, and there's never been another Samuel that I'm aware of. These are very rare things that people can do because the corrosive nature of all the things that go with it. We'd start to rationalize. If I was an ex-president, would I be giving speeches for $100,000? I think I might. And I'd be giving good speeches for $100,000 too. They wouldn't be. It's hard not to be co-opted, isn't it? And it's hard not to find yourself rationalizing whatever ultimately we want to do. That's the danger of the corrosive nature of money. And again, please don't misunderstand me. It's not the money that's a bad thing, it's the love of money. So as a Christian, if I've been blessed with money, I need to do the very best I can to make sure that I understand that money is an object to be used for God's purposes, because whose money ultimately is it anyway? It's God's, right? And how do I know it's God's? Because I'm not taking it with me, right? I'm not taking it with me. I love a story Bob Herndon told many years ago when he was the preacher here of a man who decided he could take it with him. And I think I've shared this once or twice before. So he goes to his wife before he dies and he says, honey, put all my great stuff up in the attic. And when I die and go up to heaven, I'll take it all with me. And so she does. He dies. She goes to the attic. The stuff is all still there. The wife goes, nuts. I knew I should have put it in the basement. Money can be corrosive if we let it be corrosive, if we recognize it's a tool that's not my tool, but it's God's tool, and we try to use that tool in ways that benefit other Christians, that benefit people that are in need, that benefit the poor and the impoverished, then it can be a very good thing, right? But I've got to be very careful. And I've been both very, very poor and quite well off. And there's disadvantages of being very, very poor as well, right? There's other problems and temptations and sins that can come out of poverty, just as there are temptations and sins that can come out of wealth. I want to be God's servant, whether I'm poor or whether I'm rich. I want to be God's servant, whether I enjoy good health or whether I don't. I want to be God's servant, whatever circumstance I'm in. And this is what Samuel is. This is the example that Samuel leaves us. He's always going to do the right thing. That's a hard thing for us to do. Because at times we are mistreated. And I gave you, my example of how I got hired for my current job, but I was thinking lots of thoughts that if I'd said any of them probably would have gotten me fired. So maybe I was closer to getting myself in trouble than it sounds like in the story. This is what tends to happen to us. So Samuel says to the people, you witness before God. Have I done anything that was inappropriate? Have I acted at any time without integrity? Have I enriched myself in any way by holding the job and position that I've held? And the answer from the people comes back, no. And so he demonstrates to us the fact that it can be done. He demonstrates to us the fact that we need to be responsible as Christians and recognize that we're not our own. We've been bought with a price. And was said a minute ago, it's true. Everything in this world belongs to God. And if I'm a Christian, I'm not my own. I've been bought with a price. And therefore, when I'm making decisions, I need to be thinking about things from that standpoint. Not my money, but God's. I'm God's steward. When God calls me to account for the way that I've used my time and my money, and I have to stand before God on the judgment day, the question is going to be asked of me, was I like Samuel? Was I all about loving the things of God and doing the things that God called me to do? Or was I all about myself? And that's a struggle, isn't it, for all of us? So each day as we think about these things, we think about what a challenge we all face. So that's a lesson that I learned from the life of Samuel. Samuel demonstrates that a man can be in political life and can be an honest man. We sometimes look at politicians and think they're all crooks. They're not all crooks. There are people in political life who are people of integrity who are trying to do the right thing. May not be a ton of them, but they are there. They are there. And it can be done if I don't allow myself to be co-opted. So I see that from the life of Samuel. Comments or questions on that part of Samuel's life? Mona, did you have a comment?
I just remember the statement that Harry Truman always made. He said, the buck stops here.
Yes. Yeah. If you think about Harry Truman and how he becomes elected president, he's as close as we've ever had to picking a guy out of the phone book at random. Nobody knew who Harry Truman was. When he becomes president, people are kind of like Harry who? They paid no real attention because Franklin Roosevelt had two vice presidents. One for the first 8 years he was president, one for the next 4 years. Truman was as much of an afterthought as anyone ever in political life, right?
Is anything ever mentioned about family with Samuel?
Well, we talked about a little bit about that last Sunday. He has 2 sons, right? And those 2 sons don't follow in his footsteps. So why did the children of Israel want a king? They go to Samuel and they say, you've got these 2 deadbeat sons, and after all the other countries around us have a king, right? And Samuel appears to have tried to control his sons. So unlike Eli, who doesn't seem to have made any effort to control his 2 wild boys, Samuel has fought the good fight and made the effort unsuccessfully, as most of the people in the Old Testament have. We talked last Sunday about the fact that you look at the children of great men in the Old Testament, you don't find typically great children coming from great fathers. And we tend to think, in our mind that, boy, if I've got good kids, what a brilliant father I must be. And I used the example last Sunday, when you look at Israel, he has 12 children. And out of the first 11, how many good kids does he have? 1, and it was kid number 11, right? So some of us, maybe we stopped too soon. Joseph is remarkable, right? Joseph is one of the greatest men that ever lived. But his brothers are they're a mixed group at best. So, this is another part of us as human beings. I've known more than one person who had the most adorable first child you could imagine. They were sweet and compliant and kind, and they would hold up their hands at stoplights and help little old ladies across, even though the child was just 5 years old. You thought, what an adorable child. And then they had child number 2, who was hell on wheels. And all of a sudden it dawned, when you're a parent like that and your first child is just that compliant, you think, I'm the most wonderful parent in the world. And so, you go into a restaurant and somebody else's kids are throwing a fit. And you sit there smugly and you go, well, my children would never do that. And then you have number 2. I told my own parents, if you would have quit with number 1, life would have been better for us all, but it didn't work out that way. My little sister taught me a lot of humility over the years. So yeah, Samuel has children, they want a king, but of course, what's the problem with having a king? How did the king's children turn out? They're mostly idiots. If you study the history of England from 900 AD through 1600, and you look at that list of kings, we're talking about for 700 years of human history, there's hardly a good king of England in the entire bunch. They're all thugs. The only one that I would have cared to sit down and even talk to at all is the very young Henry VIII, before everything went to his head. So they don't like Samuel's sons, but now we're going to come up with a kingship. We're going to invest authority in them, which Samuel's sons never had, and Eli's sons never had. We're going to tell them they're God's anointed, that they're there because God wants them to be there, and therefore they can do whatever they want. In other words, we're taking a system and making it as bad as it's humanly possible to make it. And we're still obsessed, in this country with quote unquote, royalty. I wouldn't want to spend 5 minutes with any single person who's considered a British royal. But we're obsessed, like somehow they've done something great. What did they do? They got born into a family of fairly dimly lit people. And I was always amazed. Think about this. The British monarchy, they were all German. So in World War I, the King of England is 99% German. He's a German. Oh, he's the king. We must salute. I mean, it's the most bizarre, strange, convoluted thing that you can possibly imagine. When you really start to look at what it is. And of course, if you weren't a Protestant, you couldn't be king. I think King George I was actually like 100th in line for the throne, but the other 99 were Roman Catholics. So George I becomes the King of England. It's the most bizarre system going, and then you invest those people with this aura like somehow God has put them in that place. And believe me, this is something that particularly in the Middle Ages, the kings cultivated the idea that we're God's anointed and therefore we can do whatever we want and therefore we can't make mistakes. And so if Henry VIII wants to kill 55,000 people, he kills 55,000 people because he's the king. And as Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 4, the king's word has power and who can say to him, what are you doing? And so Samuel warns the people, these are the things that are going to happen. And what kind of a king does Samuel appoint for the children of Israel? Who's king number 1? Saul. What do we know about Saul?
He's really tall.
He's really tall. He's head and shoulders above everybody else. And why is that important? Kings were expected to lead the people into battle. You want some dude that can fight, or at least looks like he can fight, right? And Saul was quite a good soldier. There's no doubt about that. This is one of the, I said most of these English kings were thugs for 700 years, but one of the things they were expected to do was lead the troops into battle. When Richard III fights at the Battle of Hastings against the man that will be Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII, he's leading the guys into battle, even with his scoliosis. He really, they found his body buried in a parking lot about 10 years ago. But he led his guys into battle. This was one thing kings did. So he's head and shoulders above everybody else physically. He looks the part. We want somebody to look the part of the king. And what do we know about him morally? What kind of a person is he?
Trying to give the people what they wanted too much.
But he starts out how? Starts out as a good guy. He starts out as a person of integrity. He starts out as a person of humility.
Really bashful, actually.
Yeah, it's like, I shouldn't be king even, right? He starts out very, very well. And he prophesies, the Spirit of God comes upon him. Things are initially going very, very well. And then what do we find happening to him? He gets corrupted by the power, right? God orders the children of Israel to destroy the Amalekites. And he orders that they're not to take any of the bounty, none of the cattle, none of the material of the Amalekites are they to take. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Saul is ordered to go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all they have. Spare nothing. Both man, woman, infant, suckling, ox, sheep, camel. Destroy them all. Everything was to be destroyed of Amalek. And what does Saul do? What does he end up keeping? The best of the spoils. And why do you think he kept the best of the spoils? He, of course, has a wonderful explanation for it, which shows us our ability as human beings to rationalize. He said, Lord, I'm doing it for you. We're doing it to offer these sacrifices to you. And then, of course, you also have the fact that he feared the people. He claims. We see stuff, we want stuff, and then we come up with ways to rationalize our having the stuff. And then this is what's going on. They're keeping the best of everything because it's the spoils of war. And what happens, by the way, when you get an army that starts to function that way? They want to continue down that path, right? It becomes not about we're going to execute God's judgment on Amalek. It becomes about enriching myself, and now I become a soldier of fortune. And now I'm driven by the spoils of war. And by the way, that's the way the world has worked for 30,000 years. And it's interesting that in more recent times we've sort of struggled with this idea of the spoils of war, and we've got people who think, well, if those paintings were in Germany before the Second World War and you took them to the Soviet Union after the Second World War, you should give them back. And what do the Russians say?
Who did the Germans take them from?
Who did the Germans take them from? No, not quite, but might not have been a bad question. The Russians say, by the way, who invaded the Soviet Union?
Yeah.
That was the Germans. And how did the Germans act towards the Russian people? As horrifically as anybody could possibly act. And so the Russians' view is, we're entitled to what we took. And I think they've got a certain point.
Lieutenant Winters, right, and Band of Brothers are in real life. He has a lot of silverware.
Yes, many Americans came home with war prizes. We will not ask what's in anybody's closets.
I think he earned it.
Yeah, that's the way the world works. So you get into some interesting sort of moral issues when you see kind of how the world has gone in the 21st century, where people start thinking, well, maybe, you should really give that back, like that was looted from the Germans. No, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, stole every piece of art that the Russians had that wasn't nailed down. And so when the Russians take Berlin, they're taking their stuff back. None of this stuff is as simple as sometimes it should seem to be. But we're thinking about it the way the world thinks about it, aren't we? And we're not thinking about it the way God thinks about it. But God understood the fact that if I'm waging war for the purpose of taking booty in battle, I'm going to create the wrong kind of army. And it's not going to be an army that's respectful of God or doing what God wants to do. And God said, this is how I want it done. And of course, Saul then has to start making excuses and explaining it. And, Saul does fight the Amalekites, but brings back the best of all this stuff. And so Samuel goes to Saul and he says, it repents me that I set Saul up to be king, for he's turned back from following me, and he did not perform my commandments. And he grieved Saul, and he cried unto the Lord all night. I think that tells you something about how much Samuel loved Saul. He's grieved by the fact that he's seen a man who was a good man, a man who was an honest man, a man who was a humble man, a man who was a shy man, co-opted by power. But this is what power tends to do to us. I started by saying I think good men can serve in political office, but it's hard. It's hard to serve in political office and not be co-opted. Samuel sees Saul has been co-opted. And so he goes to Saul. And Saul says, I perform the commandment of the Lord. This is called the best defense is a good offense. I performed, this is what he tells him. I did what God told me to do. And of course, Samuel says, what's the meaning then of the bleating of the sheep in mine ears and the lowing of oxen? Well, so then Saul tries to explain. And Samuel says in response to the explanation, when you were but little in your own sight, were you not made the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. The Lord sent you on a journey and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners of Amalek and fight against them until they're consumed. Wherefore then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but you went into the spoil and you did evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said unto Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. He's trying to stick to his story. The people, then he tries to explain it. The people took the spoil, verse 21, of the sheep and the oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed. But they did it to sacrifice to the Lord thy God in Gilgal. Samuel said, the Lord is great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord. We come up with ways as human beings to rationalize doing what God doesn't want us to do. And in fact, often what God has commanded us not to do. God says, don't do it. We do it anyway. And why do we do it? Because we rationalize. We rationalize what the reason for it is. People do this in our culture all the time. We're unhappy with the situation we're in. We know that this is what God wants. And we come up with a way to rationalize ourselves right out of it. It's just the way that the human brain thinks. This happens with marriage and divorce. And again, I'm not trying to say that everyone's wrong in every divorce. They're certainly not. But quite often you have marriages in for really no good reason. Irreconcilable differences, whatever in the world that means. It's because people aren't willing to be obedient to God. And so I've got to be very, very careful as a human being that I understand that this lesson. God wants me to obey the voice of the Lord. He wants me to do what God wants me to do, and sometimes that means there's going to be sacrifices that are involved. Sacrifices that are involved. It's hard for us as human beings. Charles Dickens was one of the greatest writers of the English language that ever lived. Wrote The Christmas Carol. Phenomenal work. But he ends up married to a woman that he becomes dissatisfied with because he's rich, he's famous, he can have somebody younger. She's given him, 8 or 10 children, whatever it is. She's a sweet person, but he's sort of outgrown her, you see. This is what happens to us. And so then what do we start doing? We start rationalizing what we want to do rather than what we know that God calls us to do. It's a hard thing. And again, I want to be very clear. I understand there are divorces where there's immorality involved and other things. So I'm not trying to cast everybody with the same shadow here. But we all know that in our culture, quite often people divorce simply because they're tired of the person they're with or because there's somebody that they think is going to be better. And God is saying, I consider far more important that you hearken to my word. Obey the voice of the Lord. And then Samuel says, rebellion is the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is iniquity and idolatry. Because you rejected the word of the Lord, he's rejected you from being king. People wanted a king, they got a king that was a good guy, they got a king that looked the part, and they got a guy that's corrupted by power. We sometimes say that if power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it does, most people. And it's corrupted Saul. And so Samuel now is led to go anoint somebody else king.
I think part of this Amalekite story is this verse 12 in 1 Samuel 15 says, Saul's gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone down to Gilgal. He set up his own monument.
Yeah. This is what people do of power and influence, right? They set monuments up for themselves. So anyway, Samuel is then ordered to go and anoint somebody else as king, and it's one of the children of Jesse. This is 1 Kings 16. And the first one that goes by is Eliab. Eliab is the oldest son of Jesse, and he looks the part, right? He's a tough, big, good-looking guy. And it came to pass that when he looked on Eliab, Samuel said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before me." But the Lord said unto Samuel, "Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord sees not as man sees, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Here's another lesson, right, from the life of Samuel. Doesn't matter what the person looks like on the outside. What should count is what the person's like on the inside. We have a really hard time with that in our culture because our culture is all about the visual. I grew up in California, which was one of the early adopters of cosmetic surgery. People get addicted to cosmetic surgery. Why? Because they're concerned about how they look on the outside. When where my time should be going is on the inside. And again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on all cosmetic surgery, but my point is that if the emphasis is on the wrong thing, I'm going to be led down the wrong path. And then there's no end to it, right? I'm going to fix this imperfection, which leads me to want to fix that imperfection, which leads me to be obsessed about how I look because we have a culture where people put that kind of value on how I look. And we're bothered by what other people think. And the truth of the matter is, as a Christian, I should care only about what God thinks. That's it. And that means what counts is what I am on the inside, not what I am on the outside. And if I spent 1/10 the amount of time working on the inside person that I do on the outside person, we would all be way more spiritual than we are. And so one of the lessons that I'm learning from the life of Samuel is don't worry about what somebody looks like on the outside. Because whatever I look like on the outside, there will always be somebody coming along who's better looking. There'll always be somebody coming along who's taller, who's a better athlete, who can... If I put value in those kinds of things, I'm ultimately going to be quite distressed. Because ultimately, physically, what's going to happen to me? I'm going to get old! Yeah. I would like to say that I'm not far away from being old, but the truth is I crossed that border a long time ago. Craig?
Comparison is the thief of joy.
Comparison is the thief of joy, right? That's good. It's comparison to the wrong things. If I want to compare myself to something, I should hold myself up in light of the Word of God. My confidence should be in light of the Word of God, because what do I know about this physical body? Not only is it going to get old, not only is it going to grow feeble, not only is it going to die, but if I'm a Christian, what do I know? When I die, I'm sown in corruption, but I'm raised in incorruption. Whatever I look like here, I'm going to be perfect in the next life. It doesn't matter. What I look like in this life doesn't matter, because God has prepared something far, far better for me. So we're all about that, and it's a culture where some people are famous simply because of what they look like on the outside. So you talk about a vapid, empty kind of world for people to be so obsessed with people whose lives are without God, essentially meaningless, who are living lives without hope, and who whatever they look like, that's all going to fade away. And we all see people who've had plastic surgery who are in their 70s and 80s, and what do they look like? Scary, Craig says. Do they not realize what they've done to themselves? That's what I find myself wondering. And again, I'm going to say this one more time just to be clear. I'm not trying to say that all cosmetic surgery is bad, or that if you've had cosmetic surgery that this means that you're going down the path that I'm talking about. But we need to be careful, right? We need to be careful. Somebody else have a comment? Jerry?
Didn't want to interrupt you when you were talking about Harry Truman, because I wanted to hear what else you had to say. It was good. But Harry Truman was he's a politician, but a man of the people that became very powerful in a very short period of time in the midst of a terrible war, World War II. He met with people, including from Russia and England, all the heads of them, and he stood up for America during that time. And he made a very difficult decision to kill thousands of people to end the war by dropping the atomic bombs. He's the one that gave the final decision on that. So he made some tough stuff. And he also asked Winston Churchill to give a speech. That was in his called the state of Missouri. And there's a museum there, the Winston Churchill Museum. And that's a place that when this after the war, right after the war, the first time that Winston Churchill used the phrase, an iron curtain is falling across Europe. So just some extra stuff to throw out to you.
Some bonus stuff about Harry Truman. Yeah. Truman he's absolutely a fascinating study, and he basically assumes power instantly, right? Franklin Roosevelt dies and he becomes president of the United States with really no training. But part of what he succeeds, interestingly enough, too, is there was respect then for the office of the presidency. And that, in our lifetime, unfortunately, has mostly gone away, starting with Lyndon Johnson and moving on from there. But yeah, all things we should think about. So I'll leave you with this lesson then. Don't look at what somebody looks like. It's not about how handsome I am. I know I'm handsome, but it's not about that. Not about that. You know, and the reality is, I mean, overwhelmingly, we're all fairly average-looking people. That's the nature of life. So I should not be focused on what people look like, and I shouldn't be focused on, you know, the kind of hero worship that becomes so much a part of our culture. I should be focused on the worship of God, not people. And if I'll do that, I'll be much more of what God wants me to be. Well, I hope you find the study of Samuel of some interest and benefit. It is an amazing story. His relationship with Saul is remarkable, as well as his relationship with David. We referred last Sunday briefly to the situation with the witch of Endor, when she brings Samuel back after he's died. And of course, I pointed out this was not her work, but God let Samuel appear. And of course, Samuel's message to Saul was one of death, doom, and destruction. So if anybody wants to bring somebody back from the dead and they're not telling you all the bad things that you're about to suffer, they haven't really brought anybody back from the dead, have they? I was always struck with Harry Houdini, one of the greatest magicians that ever lived, had a standing offer that he could do anything the spiritualist could do it twice as good, and explain how he did it. And he was very close friends with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was a medical doctor, physician, also the author of the Sherlock Holmes books. And he was a total believer in spiritualism, and he wants Houdini to come to a seance. And so Houdini goes to the seance. And they ask Houdini, who do you want us to bring back from the dead? And he goes, bring my mother back. And so they bring Houdini's mother back, and afterwards Houdini tells Doyle it was a total lie. And Doyle's like, how could you know with such certitude? And he said, my mother never spoke a word of English in her entire life. Thank you.